I'm Prudence Carter, the director for the Research Institute for the Center RICSRE. Center, I always forget what the acronym means. It's so shameless that I'm standing here and admitting that. But I am the director of the Research Institute for the Center for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And it's really nice to have you here today for our second Chautauqua, featuring Professor Samy Alim and Michele Landis Dauber. I have the distinct honor of introducing our moderator in the moment, who is Professor Gary Segura, and I will do that. But before I do that, I want to just say a couple of things. This is supposed to be kind of an afternoon casual, engaging intellectual affair. So let's not treat this like a conventional talk or lecture, okay? Let's just make yourselves at home, get up and feel free to have cheese and crackers and fruit and wine and coffee and tea if you'd like. And I also want to say that just, all of you have your books. Let's just have a good time today. I'm looking forward to this. This is like a 13-hour day for me, so I'm hoping that we can just be really relaxed and engaged here. The next thing I want to say is that after this evening, this is one of the reasons why the day is so long, today is also the day for the St. Clair Drake Lecture, sponsored by the Department of African and African American Studies. There is a very nice panel that's been put together in commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so that's going to be the topic for the St. Clair Drake lecture tonight. All of you are invited to move over to CEMEX Auditorium at the Business School campus, and that program begins at 7 p.m. So I hope that some of you at least, can participate in that. So let's get started. Let me introduce my dear colleague, Gary Segura, who is a professor of American politics. Many of you already know Gary, and he's also the chair of the Chicana Studies program here at the Center for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Gary is a very well-known political scientist who is the principal in the polling firm Latino Decisions. His work focuses on issues of political representation and the politics of Americans' growing Latino minority. He is the author of many, many, many works, and I won't give them all to you. Among his most recent publications are Latino Lives in America, Making It Home, which was published in 2010. He has co-authored a book called Latinos in the New Millennium, an almanac of opinion, behavior, and policy preferences. And he's one of the three principal investigators of the 2012 national election studies. And a lot of the things that have come out of this study and what we know in terms of political attitudes, we're going to be getting from the analysis that he and his team have produced. He is also an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This is someone who does extraordinary work in the academy and in the field of political science. And it's really nice. The other thing I like about Gary is that he tells it like it is. So he's really nice I think as an interrogator this afternoon as we engage with a linguistic anthropologist and a legal studies sociologist who teaches in the law school, and bringing these two works together. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Gary to the podium. He will introduce our speakers, and just thank you again for being here. Okay.
I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time before their talk, and then when we gather after the two talks, we'll have a few sort of structuring questions, and then we'll open it up to the group. Let me begin by saying thank you to Prudence for that lovely introduction, and to also tell you, if you haven't already heard, that Prudence just received her promotion to full professor at Stanford University, of which she is well earned, and it's overdue, and we are deeply proud. I want to introduce first, our first speaker today is H. Samy Alim from the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford. And he's going to be talking about his book, Articulate While Black, Barack Obama, Language and Race in the United States. Samy Alim is an associate professor of education and by courtesy in anthropology and linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. At Stanford University. Mercifully. where he directs that was a tease, where he directs the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Language and the Institute for Diversity in the Arts. So in addition to the book he's going to talk about today, he's also author of the books You Know My Steez, Rock the Mic Right, Talking Black Talk, and Global Linguistic Flows. And he's written for various media outlets, including the New York Times. Alim's recent work focuses on languaging race, which is viewing American racial politics through the lens of language, and foregrounding the role that language plays in the construction and contesting of ethno-racial identities in the United States and indeed around the world. And he's published a special issue of Discourse in Society focusing on these issues. And most importantly, the book he's going to discuss today, which he co-authored with his colleague and mentor, Geneva Smitherman. So please join me in welcoming H. Samy Alim.
Thank you, Prudence and Gary, for the introductions and for the invitations, and I'm happy to be here. We're going to try to do this the fun way. I like that invocation to have fun. Okay, so we're going to try to do that as best as we can. Let's see. Okay. All right, so... Okay. So I have about, let's say, 20, 25 minutes to discuss some of the themes that are in Articulate While Black, or some of the things that we discuss in the book. Does the mic sound good? Everyone? Okay. Some of the things that we discuss in the book, and I'm just going to give you sort of a general idea just to bring us all back on the same page. I know many of you have read this in incredible detail, so I'm just going to put it back all on the same page and give you a general overview of maybe some of the ideas that are in here, and then I'll pass the mic, and then we'll continue from there. So the first thing that I usually say about this book when I'm talking about it is the title. The title gives you a good sense of why we wrote it, okay, and why we think this is important. So me and Geneva would have these conversations with many of our colleagues and friends that we're doing this book on Barack Obama. Okay, hey, we're writing a book on Barack Obama, 2008, 2009. It's a couple of linguists writing a book about Barack Obama. Okay, we talk to black friends and colleagues, and they'd say, well, what's the title? And we'd say, Articulate While Black. And there'd be an ooh of recognition because of the socially charged nature of Articulate and the racially charged nature of Articulate, right? And then we'd be talking also to our non-black friends and colleagues about this book, and we're doing a book, and they would ask about the title, and we'd say Articulate While Black, and they, the response would be like, you're right. He's so articulate, right? And that "oh Lord" there captures exactly why we felt like there was an even greater need to write about this, because the more we talk about it, the more those discursive and linguistic patterns are reproduced in the very discussing of the book, right? And so we went on from there, but we talk about Articulate While Black in a number of different ways, and I just want to run some of these down for you quickly by way of introduction. So the book is about two things. One, Barack Obama's language use and America's response to it. I think the main premise of the book is how Barack Obama talks and how we talk about how Barack Obama talks. Okay, those two things as equally important factors that tell us about language and racial politics in the United States. Okay, so Barack Obama is the subject of the book, or may be the subject of the book, but if you'll notice, his name's in small letters, really small letters in the subtitle. Why is everybody calling him articulate? The adjective. But he is importantly a point of departure for us to consider the social, cultural, linguistic, and educational implications of what it means to articulate while black, the verb. Okay, what does it mean to articulate while black? That's the really the deeper philosophical question that underlies this book, is what does it mean? So as you're reading this, what comes up time and time again is, what does it mean to speak as a racialized subject in contemporary America? Okay, that's a really broad, big philosophical question of what happens when you open your mouth in public space and how that's interpreted. Never mind if you open your mouth and it's mediated, right? And your language has a life beyond that particular moment. So what does it mean to speak as a racialized subject in contemporary America? In an America that is radically changing and shifting, I might add, right? We talked about since 2012, the election, we've been using the phrase the new America a lot. And I think that has a lot of implications for this, right? What does it mean to speak as a racialized subject in the new America? And for an answer to that, I'm going to turn to critical race theorist Chris Rock, because we're going to have fun in here, right? Prudence said we could have fun in here. That means we can play a little bit of Chris Rock, doesn't it? Okay. Let's see.
What's the big thing this year? Election. Colin Powell. He should run. He could win. Colin can win. He should run. He can't win. Colin Powell can't win. Colin Powell got a better chance of winning the bronze in female gymnastics than being the president of the United States. Get the fuck out. White people ain't voting for Colin Powell. Say they are not. Okay? Just gonna soup his head up, make him run, he'll get killed trying to run. Shit, Colin Powell. White people say they're gonna vote for him because it seemed like the right thing to say. It just seems like a cool thing to say. Yeah, I'm gonna vote for him. It just seemed like the right thing to say. Just like if you ask somebody if they want to be an organ donor, they always say yeah. Nobody wants to be an organ donor. Nobody. It just seemed like the right thing to say.
Okay, it seems like the right thing to say, right? Okay, now I'm going to skip to this part here, and we're going to focus on that bullet point, articulate as an exceptionalizing discourse. I think Chris Rock captures it really well.
And Idaho, now I gotta go kill him to get my eyes back.
Right after this whole segment right here.
Colin Powell can't be president. Get down. You know I can tell Colin Powell can't be president? Whenever Colin Powell on the news, white people always give him the same compliments. Always the same compliments. How do you feel about Colin Powell? He speaks so well. He's so well spoken. He speaks so well. I mean, he really speaks well. He speaks so well. Like that's a compliment. Speak so well is not a compliment, okay? Speak so well, some shit you say about retarded people that can talk. What do you mean he speaks well? What, he have a stroke the other day? He's a fucking educated man. How the fuck you expect me to sound? You dirty motherfucker. What are you talking about? He speaks so well. You're talking about he speaks so well. What voice were you looking to come out of his mouth? What the fuck did you expect me to sound like? I'ma drop me a bomb today. I'll be prez old dear. Fuck out of here.
All right. I'm done. So when we talk about Chris Rock in the book, actually we substitute, as many of you now know, Colin Powell. We just take Colin Powell out of that dialogue. So you're reading it thinking Barack Obama, Barack Obama, Barack Obama, when really it's Colin Powell and really it's 15, 16 years ago, et cetera, right? And so we're kind of talking about that. But I think a real quick note on articulate is that by the time I think you get to the end of chapter 1 or chapter 2, that this focus on articulate and it's mapping onto quote unquote standard English and it's mapping onto whiteness and it's mapping onto intelligence, all of these things overlooks the fact that the first 3 letters of articulate are A-R-T, the art of speaking and artful ways of speaking that are valued by particular communities that are not necessarily valued in the same way. And Chris Rock is, I think, a perfect example of that. Okay, so the skit is loaded with insightful folk and social and linguistic analyses, which we're going to return to later. But articulate as an exceptionalizing discourse, we're drawing on 2 scholars here mostly. Tim Wise, white anti-racist scholar who writes about white privilege expressly for white people, okay? And Imani Perry, who's an African-American studies scholar, legal race studies at Princeton. okay, who talks broadly about exceptionalizing discourses in the work that they do. So we're pulling these two together and thinking about racism 2.0 as, quote, enlightened exceptionalism, which allows for, even celebrates the achievement of individual people of color, but only because those individuals are generally seen as different from a less appealing, even pathological black or brown rule. Okay, so as Barack Obama took the national stage by storm, if you go back to 2007, 2008, you'll remember these comments. Okay, you'll remember that perhaps conservative linguist John McWhorter, who's a Stanford PhD, by the way, in linguistics, I might add. Jokingly referred to Barack Obama's way of speaking as, oh, he's got a black scent, right? And Ralph Nader jumped in the fray and said, oh, Obama's going to do that white talking thing again. Okay. Snoop Dogg, okay. I'm waiting for someone to say Snoop Lion, because that's his new name. Okay. So Snoop Lion jumps in and says, well, you know, we're really impressed with this guy because he's got the right conversation. Okay. So you have all of these viewpoints on Barack Obama's language, and then you have Harry Reid's racialized comments that Barack Obama will be elected not only because he is light-skinned, but because he, quote, speaks no Negro dialect unless he wants to have one. Okay, and that gave us all pause, and we were thinking about what exactly does that mean? Number one, what does this obsession and this monitoring of Barack Obama's speech mean? Two, what do these specific comments mean, and how do we put them together in a way that informs our analysis of America's racial politics? Okay, so we start the book with this quote. I'm not going to spend too much time in here on this because I think everybody's well aware of what white cultural hegemony is. What's important is how there was a smirk in the audience. That was lovely, right? But there's a comment here that Barack Obama talks about in Audacity of Hope that I think captures white cultural hegemony in the nutshell. Okay, and it was a really interesting way to do that. So you're a candidate being racialized as a black candidate, speaking to a mostly white electorate and introducing yourself by capturing white cultural hegemony to them. Seems counterintuitive here, like that wouldn't be probably the best approach. But we share this because it's exactly that kind of white cultural hegemony in terms of language that we're constantly writing against, as you saw in every single page of the book. This concept of language and race is really big for us. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on it in the book because, as you could tell, it's geared towards both a mass audience as well towards an academic audience. So we didn't spend a whole lot of time on a theoretical framework, but this concept of language and race was important for us to introduce. And language and race is examining the politics of language through the lens, the politics of race, through the lens of language. We feel that language is under-examined, yet a crucial aspect of racial politics in the United States. And this goes for the general public as well as for scholars of race and ethnicity generally, right? That even though language is a central means by which race can be culturally understood, it is often overlooked analytically, okay? We also want to address the lack of a critical dialogue on language in the United States that recognizes language generally as a site of cultural struggle. So talking about race and beyond race in terms of gender, sexuality, citizenship, etc. If we ask the question, are we a nation of cowards when it comes to language? Okay, generally no one would have any idea what we were talking about because we don't have a developed discourse on language in the same way that we have a developed discourse on race. So if we said the discourse on race or the race conversation or taking the dialogue on race to the next level, everyone in here would sort of understand that and find some way to grasp onto that, whether or not you agreed with Eric Holder or not. But if we said cowards when it comes to language, you'd have to do a double take and look twice and ask me what I meant. So we're trying to center that. Language and race is how can we think differently, more critically about these relationships, okay, between language, race, and power. Okay, so here you have Barack Obama getting that dirt off his shoulder like Jay-Z, okay, giving his wife a pound, okay, and singing Al Green at the Apollo. My voice is sore today or else I just might have to break out. Okay. And then you would have young Jeezy here, Obama joking about young Jeezy, saying that he jokes about young Jeezy to Michele. And Michele responds the way Jeezy does. Yeah. For anybody who knows Jeezy's ad libs, Joan's laughing, because that's pretty much Jeezy in a nutshell. No, just kidding. But his ad libs have made him popular. So Obama then performs blackness in all these different ways that are, cross-generational, as you can see, right? Performing various forms of blackness in this way. And I think what was important for us was, given that black language is monitored and mocked and maligned in so many ways, what does it mean that we have a president who can engage blackness and perform blackness linguistically in this way? What are the social and cultural implications? Okay. Okay. All right. So we argue in the book that Barack Obama's mastery of black cultural modes of discourse was crucial to his being elected, and that he might not have gotten elected without it. And for some obvious and not so obvious reasons, we argue again that, quote, the brother with the funny name wouldn't have gotten elected if he couldn't kick it in ways that were, quote, familiarly black. Okay. And that both means what you think it means, and it means what you doesn't think it means. Does that make sense? Okay. It's a little more complicated, in other words. When I say familiarly black, I'm imagining that everyone in here has some, in fact, when I said that, some voice probably passed through or cycled through your imagination. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. And so I want to play a little clip, and we can talk about this a little bit, because maybe make it a little bit more participatory. Okay, so let's see. This clip here is of Barack Obama speaking in 4 different contexts. One is a political rally in Chicago. The other one is a press conference, and the other one is a campaign, another campaign rally, this time in South Carolina. And the fourth one is Barack Obama ordering food and dealing with the cashier in a restaurant, okay, in Washington, D.C., okay? So you're going to follow the 4 contexts closely, because it's a montage, and it doesn't give you any time to basically transition. It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? And in your mind, if you could help me do the analysis of Barack Obama's style shifting, I think this clip gives you a nice range, a sense of Barack Obama's linguistic range. And we'll talk about, in particular, the call and response mode of communication that we can get into at length, okay? So let's try this. This is context 1.
What I tell people is, look, first of all, I'm from Chicago. I'm from the South Side. For every day we wait or point fingers or drag our feet, more Americans will lose their jobs. More families will lose their savings. More dreams will be deferred and denied. They're trying to bamboozle you. It's the same old okey doke. Y'all know about okey doke, right? It's the same old stuff. It's like if anybody starts getting one of these emails saying Obama is a Muslim.
See what you notice visually, too.
I've been the member of the same church for almost 20 years, praying to Jesus. with my Bible. Don't let people turn you around because they're just making stuff up. That's what they do. They try to bamboozle you, hoodwink you.
Can we just play this last clip again? This time focus again really closely.
Old okey doke.
Okay. Here we go.
They're trying to bamboozle you. It's the same old okey doke. Y'all know about okey doke, right? It's the same old stuff. It's like if anybody starts getting one of these emails saying Obama is a Muslim. I've been the member of the same church for almost 20 years, praying to Jesus. With my Bible. Don't let people turn you around because they're just making stuff up. That's what they do. They try to bamboozle you. Hoodwink you. How about that?
Last context.
Last cup. No, I got it. There you go. You just keep that. Where's my team? You got my team? No, we straight.
Okay. So this will be a little bit participatory in my remaining time. What did people notice, particularly in that South Carolina speech where he's walking around, right? What did people notice? What did people hear? What did people see? Anything? Yep.
It was very much like church. One thing I noticed is the woman fanning herself.
Right, right. You have the placard being used very productively. Right? Okay, so you saw that visually. Yes, what else? Oh, were you calling? Okay. Oh, that's fine. We have 5 minutes.
You watched him turn and make eye contact with people all the way around.
This was his walk,
Right,
actually, right?
right. He had this slow, steady pace.
Yep, which the preacher
Yep.
style.
He
Yep.
quoted from, he picked, what did he say? Don't let them turn you
Don't
around.
turn you around.
Like, yeah, don't let people turn you around.
Yep.
You know, that's the
very,
call.
That's very typical, right? You might hear that on any Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay, and it could be used on a variety of different contexts. Don't them turn you around from X, Y, and Z. What else? Anything?
I noticed the people who were like, yeah, yes, sir.
Falling
And
over the
then
rail.
people who
Yeah.
were looking down.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, I didn't know if there was a strong racial correlation, but there were the people who seemed a little bit uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and there were the people who were egging them, just like, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The chorus.
Not everybody was responding to this in the same way, clearly, right? And you could look at the racial correlation there over, if you watch this tape, that's usually what people sort of think about when they see the correlation. Because you have some people literally falling over the rail. Okay, then you have other people who are still blank faced and not really knowing how to participate. Okay, so you get to see a lot of this, but there's one sort of critical point here to this is that you see, and I'll probably end on this. Okay, is that you see Barack Obama speaking and doing so many things, right? Throwing out the okey doke, right? Throwing out all these references. But don't let people turn you around. Like when you get those emails that say Barack Obama is a Muslim, okay? And I think that's so rich, just that one particular statement, okay? Because if you remember 2007, 2008, the main discourses against Barack Obama's candidacy were, there was twofold. One, he was not even an American. Okay, and 2, he was not a Christian. Okay? Not only he was not a Christian, but he was a secret Muslim. Okay, so this message that don't let people turn around when you get emails saying that Barack Obama is a Muslim, etc., is really important because you have the call and response that happens when people are mutually present to each other. Okay? Like the right that just came from James right there.
I can't help it.
Okay.
Sorry.
You have the call and response because we're mutually present, but there's also a signification that occurs with Barack Obama using texts in particularly sophisticated ways. So the bamboozled and hoodwinked, I expected people to jump on immediately, right? So what's happening, of course, is Barack Obama is reinterpreting the text of Malcolm X in this speech such that that text is being brought back and reinterpreted. So if you look at Skip Gates' theory of signification, it's about the reinterpretation of text in an entirely new context to produce different meanings. So you think about a candidate for the American presidency, running to be head of state, being racialized as black, reinterpreting the text that was the enemy of the state just 4 decades ago. And we know what happened to Malcolm X, right? And we know the FBI files and all of that. We don't need to run that down. We're very familiar with that. So reinterpretation and signification in this sense draws on a text that was almost, right, implausible in that context. So the falling over the rail in our reading is not just the mutually present call and response of this, it's also the fact that there's a sophisticated socio-historical knowledge that depends on how these texts are read and responded to. So some people might not be sharing that as well, right? And that gets into a really complicated form of signification that's happening here. Why I want to end on this point is because when you think about language and race, remember we talked about familiarly black ways of speaking and how that might not mean in particular ways the way we might think of them? We started this conversation on language and race, and you have this right here, this visual, of Martin Luther King, right, and Barack Obama. You've seen a lot of this. what was interesting was that talking in ways that were familiarly black, with a black preacher tradition, most people assumed was for the black vote or for the black electorate, but it was critically important for the white vote as well and for the white electorate, because white Americans that we talked to and surveyed, this sampling of a black American preacher style allowed them to create rhetorical links between Barack Obama, who was constructed as a man with a father from Kenya, who had been studying in a Muslim madrasa in Indonesia. Hawaii is not even part of the United States. Constructed in this way, right? It allowed people to create those links to make him both American and Christian. So by becoming African American through performance of the preacher, it both Americanized him and Christianized him. And that's how you read, that's how we're reading the production of black language in this space in a little bit more sort of nuanced fashion. And of course, it's far more complicated, as you know from the book, than what I just said. But that's just a little sample, and I think that's a good point to end on, so the transition. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Oops.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's only gonna take a second though.
Yeah, sure.
Good. Works. Alrighty. All good.
No. Give me your intro. Okay, it's my privilege to introduce the second speaker today. And our second speaker is Michele Landis Dauber. And she's going to talk about her book, The Sympathetic State, Disaster Relief, and the Origins of the American Welfare State. Michele is a professor of law and, by courtesy, sociology, and also the Bernard Bergreen Faculty Scholar here at Stanford University. While The Sympathetic State is her first book, she's published many other articles on the relationship between welfare programs and disaster relief and the formation of the modern American welfare state. She has focused her scholarship on a variety of aspects of the history of the New Deal and the fate of the legal doctrines and the policies that flowed from that important historical event. She's also written about a variety of other topics, including the abortion clinic controversies, Social Security privatization, affirmative action, and, for something very different, the history of administrative law during the War of 1812. So that's obviously a very broad sweep of legal scholarship. Michele Landis Dauber is the winner of the 2006 Walter Gores Award. Professor Dauber is only the second law professor to receive Stanford's highest teaching honor. Before joining the Stanford Law School faculty in 2001, she was a clerk to Judge Stephen Reinhardt of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. So with that, please join me in welcoming Michele Landis Dauber.
Well, that was terrific first presentation, and I really enjoyed reading the book. I don't know where you went. There you are. That was great. I didn't know I was going to be following Chris Rock, though. I'm not very happy about that. So I will be nowhere near as entertaining. And I really am excited to be doing this, and I really appreciate CSRE inviting me to participate in this. When I saw the announcement about the, I have no idea how to say this word, Chautauqua events, I thought, oh, that just sounds great. I think everything that can be done to create more community and conversation is a good thing, break down hierarchy between students and faculty, and bring people together across disciplines in this area. So I'm really excited to be here. The American welfare state is well known for being weak, cheap, and tardy. So how then are we going to understand the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina when the Bush administration took a huge political hit for not taking enough responsibility for the suffering of Gulf Coast residents. Now, since Katrina, we've spent billions relieving hurricane victims, and we're poised to spend a lot more to rebuild New Orleans. And George Bush, who was not known for his ability to admit errors, spent months doing acts of public penance, traipsing down to Covington, Louisiana in the weeks after the hurricane to build a house for a black family displaced by Katrina. And that visit to Covington was his 8th since the storm. Meanwhile, during the 2008 election, which we just talked about, the leading Democratic candidates all repeatedly visited New Orleans, and they all brought ever more generous proposals and plans. And then when Bush was tasked by President Obama with bringing relief to Haiti, he was directly asked by journalists whether he saw it as a chance to atone for his failure in Katrina. So if Katrina's any guide, and the first President Bush's experience with Hurricane Andrew suggests that it is, disaster relief is the real third rail of American politics, and politicians should treat it as a private matter at their own peril. But what about the millions of people, Americans, who face overwhelming medical expenses, home foreclosures, skyrocketing consumer debt, plant closings, pension fund abrogations, outsourcing, declining returns to education, and the litany of other risks cataloged in the daily paper, because nobody seems to be suffering any political consequences from failing to do anything about this. And in fact, the Republican Party has really built a dominant political position out of criticizing any effort to spend federal money on these risks as hopelessly liberal, a sign of big government run amok, a tax and spend nightmare for the middle class. We could think about Bill Clinton's humiliating defeat on health security and the lousy Obama health reform, and now Obama's willingness to cut Social Security benefits. And these things only really serve to underscore the point. So how do we reconcile these two conclusions? Is it that natural disasters are public and man-made disasters are private? Because that doesn't really seem right, as the billions that were paid to the relatives of the September 11th victims show. Or maybe it's a question of scale. Katrina left hundreds of thousands of people without homes or jobs. But that also doesn't seem right, because the business cycle has 9 million people were foreclosed, so that doesn't make it. So maybe we should distinguish between risk, which people knowingly somehow undertake in return for the possibility of gain, or disaster, which is involuntary, letting people suffer the consequences of their own miscalculations, and taking on economic risk seems necessary to get the benefits of free markets and capital and discipline and whatever. But maybe there's just no social gain in letting disaster victims endure the consequences of their misfortune. But we could multiply ad infinitum the cases of banks, car manufacturers, insurance companies, and other corporations that are all getting big, fat public subsidies to mitigate their own poor results. And it's not at all clear that society as a whole is even served by relieving disaster victims and leaving people to face risks on their own. After all, an appreciable number of homes on the Gulf Coast that were rebuilt with public dollars are going to be swept away in a future hurricane. So apparently the question of which misfortunes are public and which are private is a political question, and it's not inherent in the nature of things. So the stakes are high, as the contrast between the billions of dollars for Katrina and the missing millions of dollars for single-payer health insurance illustrate. So this insight, this is really bugging me in my face. Okay, all right. So this insight that in America, it's better to be a disaster victim than just part of the ordinary poor is not a new idea. It's in fact an idea with a really long history, although it's generally thought that there was no federal redistribution in this country before the New Deal except for veterans' pensions. That's actually not the case. And so I go through in the book in some detail and show how federal disaster relief goes back to the very first years of the Republic, and we're talking about the late 18th century. So briefly, Congress started appropriating money in the earliest days of the Republic for events like fires and floods, riots. Sometimes the early bills were for compensation for property owners. More often, they were for general relief distribution. And by about 1820, private bills gave way to more general relief appropriations for classes of people, like sufferers by the fire in Alexandria, for example. So during the late 19th century, this practice escalated so that there were both more appropriations, so about twice as many between 1860 and 1930 as between 1790 and 1860. And they were for a lot more money and a lot more people and a lot more cases. And there were several features of these early appropriation debates. First, the recipients of federal aid had to be seen as blameless for whatever caused their need. Second, what had been done before and might be done in the future was very important. So discussions of precedent dominated most debates. And third, by the late 19th century, the constitutionality of these appropriations was settled. So there were occasional questions, usually political or sectional reasons, but there was wide agreement that Congress could spend in the general welfare and not just under what we call in constitutional law an enumerated power, and that Congress had, by its long practice, already determined that relief for people who were, quote, poor through no fault of their own was indeed in the general welfare. And furthermore, there was also agreement that this determination was for Congress alone to make. So if Congress got it wrong, the remedy was at the polls, not in court, and there was no judicial review of legislative determinations in this field. And so this view was highly explicit. It was widely shared in Congress, in legal briefs, and constitutional treatises. It was taught in all U.S. law schools, including Harvard, from which many of the New Deal lawyers were later drawn. And so as an illustration of exactly how insulated from review Congress thought it was when it was dealing with disaster relief as opposed to other kinds of redistribution, there were even very frequent calls to sort of damn the Constitution. So to the extent that there was even any serious debate or objection, which was not very often, to giving out disaster relief, or as a way of disclaiming one's own supposed objections to doing this, congressmen or senators would sometimes advert to some kind of a natural law theory of the state based on mercy or sympathy. So one congressman told the House that, quote, mingled with the appeals that come to us for help are the cries of children and the petitions of women, homeless, shelterless, hungry, and in this presence I cannot stop to argue the literal construction of the Constitution. Often members would admit that even if the appropriation was unconstitutional, they would gladly vote for it and then throw themselves on the mercy of the people who they were pretty sure would approve. Ghosts of strict constructionism who had voted similarly, Madison, Calhoun, Breckinridge, they were often resurrected for support because they had supported earlier disaster relief appropriations. So by the time of the New Deal in the 1930s, Congress had already appropriated funds over 100 times for events like fires, floods, hurricanes, wars, earthquakes. And these were direct payments from the Treasury to the afflicted population that were administered through centralized federal relief bureaucracies like the Freedmen's Bureau that evaluated applications and distributed benefits according to statutory eligibility criteria set by Congress. So for example, in the late 19th century, millions of dollars were spent by the federal government following repeated Mississippi River floods, and $300,000, was appropriated for the victims of a Midwestern drought in 1895, and these were just repeated incidences. Well, so that's the background. I've described the American welfare state, based on this history, as the sympathetic state, in order to get at what I think is its signal characteristic, which is generous federal relief for people who are in distress through no fault of their own, and no help for people who appear to be at fault for their own problems, even if their need is quite severe. Not surprisingly, there have been lots of attempts throughout history to claim that the poor and unemployed are also disaster victims and hence should be treated with the same generosity as other victims. In the 19th century, these efforts to extend the idea of disaster relief to the ordinary poor were usually unsuccessful. At the time, the unemployed were much more likely to be seen as the victims of their own inherent vices, as lazy and unwilling to work for the market wage, rather than as the blameless victim of a widespread catastrophe. And that view persisted until the New Deal. And at that time, Roosevelt and members of his administration discovered the long history of this direct role of the federal government in dispensing relief for disasters, and they explicitly, sort of unearthed these precedents and relied on them and cited them in arguing that all the people in need of assistance during the Great Depression were equally the victims of a great disaster and thus entitled to the same measure of federal relief and the same generosity that the country has always shown towards disaster victims. And they made this case in a variety of venues, in political speeches, in Supreme Court arguments and briefs, in novels, films, photographs, exhibitions, and plays. New Dealers repeatedly called the Depression a, quote, economic earthquake, whose victims, who were chiefly the elderly and unemployed, were just as deserving of federal aid as victims of the natural variety of earthquake. And FDR himself was sort of a storm chaser. He frequently gave speeches in support of the New Deal at the site of floods, cyclones, dust storms, hurricanes. And as he said in 1936, in the midst of a severe Western drought, quote, "We no longer believe that human beings hit by flood, drought, unemployment, or any other national disaster should be left to the care of private charity or state and local governments." Often he would compare the flood or the hurricane to the Depression, telling the crowd to, quote, "take a lesson about the role of the federal government in helping those in need through no fault of their own." And this phrase, "through no fault of their own," is sort of the signal or signature phrase. And in fact, it's still, you can hear it today. I just got some kind of a charitable solicitation for some random thing, and it was like, help the orphans in need through no fault of their own. So this phrase shows up over and over and over again. FDR ran for re-election in 1936 on a platform that included the right to federal aid to anyone, quote, overtaken by disaster. So the very idea of a Great Depression, capital G, capital D, is itself a sign of the administration's success, really, in representing the entire country as a collective victim of a grave singular disaster. Roosevelt's relief captain, Harry Hopkins, said in a 1937 radio address, these programs, that is the New Deal's programs, Social Security, Works Progress, weren't, quote, something new and revolutionary and frightful, but were, quote, entirely traditional American assistance to help groups of citizens recover from disaster or other circumstances beyond their control. And one important effort in this stream was the production of documentary film. And documentary film was a new genre. It really wasn't developed. The government actually developed the first successful documentary films in American history, maybe in film history. And one of those was called The River, and it was produced by the New Deal's Farm Security Administration. The film was one of the most commercially successful documentary films of all time. It was made by Per Lawrence, who was sort of the Michael Moore of his time. And it was distributed by Paramount and seen by millions of people. And it was intended to build support for various New Deal programs through an elaborate analogy between the Great Mississippi River flood of 1937 and floods in general and the Depression. And I'm going to show you a clip from the movie, which is not going to be anywhere near as good as Chris Rock, but it's what I have. And then we'll talk about some of the ways that these arguments were raised. Okay.
Food and water needed at Louisville, 500 dead, 5,000 ill. Food and water needed at Cincinnati. Food and medicine needed at Lawrenceburg, 55,000 homeless in Evansville. Food and medicine needed in Aurora. Food and medicine and shelter and clothing for 750,000 down in the valley. Last time we held the levee, but the Mississippi claimed her valley. She backed into Tennessee and Arkansas and Illinois and Missouri. She spread her arms over thousands of acres of land. And she left farms ruined, stock drowned, houses torn loose. 1903, 1907, 1913, 1916, 1922, 1937. We built 100 cities and 1,000 towns, but at what a cost? For a quarter of a century, we have been forcing more and more farmers into tenancy. Today, 40% of all the farmers in the Great Valley are tenants, 10% are sharecroppers, down on their knees in the valley. A share of the crop, their only security, no home, no land of their own, aimless, footloose, and impoverished. Unable to eat even from the land, because their cash crop is their only livelihood. Credit at the store, their only reserve. No new continent to build. A generation whose people knew Kings Mountain and Shiloh. A generation whose people knew Fremont and Custer. But a generation facing a life of dirt and poverty, disease and drudgery. Growing up without proper food, medical care or schooling. Ill-clad, ill-housed, and ill-fed. And in the greatest river valley in the world.
Okay, not Chris Rock. So I'm going to try to draw your attention to two features of this film. First, the fluid movement that happens between the flood disaster and other social problems like farm tenancy and rural poverty. The key characteristic of a disaster is not some quality of the event. It doesn't have to have natural origins, and even natural disasters usually have some kind of a man-made causal component. The key characteristic is the quality of the victim's relation to it. They have to be blamelessly stricken through no fault of their own. And second, although this is a film about the problems of the Deep South and of agricultural laborers there are no black people in this movie. There's not a single black person in this movie anywhere, ever. Even the field hands picking cotton are white women toting around adorable little blonde, fat, white babies. The complete erasure of all black people from the Mississippi Delta in this film points us to a really important fact that has ramifications for the U.S. welfare state. The film seeks to highlight the blameless qualities of the floods and, by extension, the Depression's victims. Apparently, white people made better candidates for blameless victimization at the hands of fate than black people, even though the vast majority of the million people who were impacted by the 1937 flood, which was the worst flood disaster in U.S. history, left 1 million people homeless. Most of those were black people. They are not in the movie. They're not the only people who aren't in the movie, though. White men are also mostly not in this movie. There's no father at the dinner table. The scene of domesticity was lacking a male figure. This suggests, not very surprisingly, that notions of fate and responsibility are gendered as well as racialized. Now, this isn't the only racial editing of New Deal propaganda photographs, and I don't have time to tell the whole story, although it is the subject of chapter 4 in the book. The government employed a very developed bureaucratic apparatus with very tight control over the content of the images that were presented to the public. So this is a picture in the refugee camps, and I tell the story in the book of Walker Evans, who's a very famous photographer and someone with far left political sympathies, Communist Party member, went to the area where the flood disaster was the worst, and during the same time Lawrence was there making the film, in fact, and visited the refugee camps. And Edwin Locke and Walker Evans, when they went to these camps, what they saw was quite different conditions in the black camps and the white camps. They wanted to document the conditions in the black camps. But their photographs were destroyed and also suppressed by the government in favor of photos that showed the white flood victims. So this is an image that was not shown until many, many years later that Walker Evans took in the camps. And what he was trying to do with some of these pictures was document the very poor conditions that African-American refugees were in. This actually became this is the image on the cover of the book, and it became the sort of, it was a Life magazine photo of the year in 1937. It won editor and publisher honors. It was the cover of the Red Cross's 1937 annual reporting on the Red Cross efforts during the disaster, and it became the sort of picture of the year and the image of the flood. And it was actually called Madonna of the Flood, so nothing subtle about the iconography of that photo. Okay. So this, so the 1937 flood was a really pivotal moment in the life of the New Deal. In fact, the images circulated at one of the most important sort of historical moments. It was right when the Supreme Court, the high water mark coincided with the Supreme Court arguments over the Social Security Act and the legitimacy of federal power. So the stakes were very high, and the administration was really eager to avoid any political misstep, and it very carefully culled the photos and the film to ensure that only the most sympathetic images were presented to the public. So this evidence suggests empirically what we probably already know from common sense, which is that African Americans stand in a really problematic relationship to the sympathetic state. And in America, one of the most consequential aspects of racism, in fact, is that it's harder to represent black people as blameless than it is white people. The characteristics that are assigned to blacks in American racial ideology, that they're lazy, criminal, irresponsible, undermine efforts to represent them as blameless victims in all but the most obvious circumstances, for example, in a hurricane. So the notable exception to this rule was during the immediate post-Reconstruction period, when the racial logic flipped momentarily, and there's a discussion of that in the book in the section where I talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. White Southerners, especially white Southern males, were seen as lazy and worthless, and African Americans were seen as innocent victims of the massive moral crime of slavery. So given this difficulty, it isn't really surprising that the Roosevelt administration actively suppressed images of blacks from the public political defense of its relief and Social Security programs, even if it didn't suppress all black participation in those programs. So in 1937, whites, and particularly white women and babies, were more plausible candidates for disaster victims, for people being shown as blamelessly down on their luck through no fault of their own. Now, in the case of Katrina, we can think of plenty of evidence that we haven't yet moved much beyond 1937. In the hurricane's aftermath, a number of people suggested that the people who had lost out had no one but themselves to blame because they had failed to evacuate when they were told to do so. And then there were the stories of the fraud and abuse. On the other hand, there were some hopeful indications that sympathy for victims of Katrina brought down the Bush administration and may have helped to propel the first African-American president into office. The fallout from the Republican failure in Katrina and deep support for the tradition of American disaster relief also may have helped Obama win his second term, in that it led to the decision by Chris Christie to break with his party and endorse Obama's handling of Hurricane Sandy. And many people speculated that it was Mitt Romney's support for the privatization of disaster relief in the sort of midst of Hurricane Sandy that led in part to his loss. That was probably overdetermined. And congressional Republicans were savaged, I mean, just absolutely savaged for their refusal to provide relief to Hurricane Sandy victims. And interestingly, in light of the 37 flood and the evidence that I present about it, most of the Sandy victims shown in the media were white, although over 50% of those who were affected by Sandy were racial minorities. So, to sum it up, the important fact is that in moving circumstances across the line between private misfortune and public disaster or vice versa, the key question is whether claimants can show that they've been victimized by fate and left needy through no fault of their own. In the American context, need alone, even very profound need, has never been sufficient to demand a public response. And the key question to answer is not whether the hopeful recipient of public assistance is needy, but why they're needy and who is to blame for it. So following the public disgust with the government's failure to aid Katrina and Sandy's victims was a nearly equal level of anger at the government's decision to bail out corporations that were too big to fail, even though it was clear to everyone that AIG and Citicorp had brought their own problems on themselves. And like Katrina, this reaction seems to cross parties and ideological lines. So both the Tea Party and Move On conclude that helping people who bear responsibility for their own problem violates some very basic clauses of the American social contract. And these clauses require the government to come to the aid of those in need through no fault of their own and bar it from aiding people whose problems are self-inflicted. So I think the takeaway for the purposes of this talk is that aspects of social and political culture that make it particularly difficult, not just for African Americans, but for members of other minority groups, and I have some talk in there about Native Americans as well, to portray themselves as blameless victims of forces beyond their control, leave them stranded in a very difficult position with respect to obtaining state benefits. So, thank you.